The aluminum serving spoon felt heavier than the assault rifle she once carried through the mountains of Afghanistan. Petty Officer First Class Marina Volkov kept her expression neutral as she ladled another portion of reconstituted mashed potatoes onto the plastic tray held by recruit Dawson, whose smirk suggested he found something amusing about a woman serving his meal. "This is painful to watch," muttered recruit Thompson to his companion as they moved through the chow line. 5'0" and probably never seen real action. His voice carried just enough for Marina to hear, which was exactly his intention. The other recruits chuckled, their confidence fed by the assumption that kitchen duty meant weakness. Before we continue this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar situations where someone was underestimated based on appearances in your community. Marina had been operating under light cover at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility for 3 weeks, her true identity known only to Commander Hayes and the facility psychologist. The mission parameters were simple: observe recruitment protocols and assess psychological pressure points in the training pipeline. What she had not anticipated was becoming the target of that same psychological pressure herself. The mess hall buzzed with the typical evening energy of hungry recruits finishing another day of preliminary conditioning. Steam rose from the serving trays as Marina methodically filled plates, her movements efficient and economical in a way that spoke of military precision to anyone trained to recognize such things. These recruits were not yet trained to recognize anything beyond their own immediate assumptions. "Look at her trying to look tough," Recruit Barnes whispered to his table mate as they carried their trays past the serving line. "Probably thinks serving slop makes her some kind of warrior." The comment drew snickers from the surrounding tables, where 23 male recruits were learning to bond through shared derision. Marina continued serving, her pale green eyes noting every face, every comment, every gesture of dismissal. In the mountains, such inattention to detail would have meant death. Here, it simply meant these young men had no idea they were being evaluated by someone whose kill count exceeded their combined push-up records. Recruit Martinez approached the serving station with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequence. "Hey, kitchen lady," he said loudly enough for his friends to hear, "you got anything back there that actually tastes like food, or are we stuck with this garbage again?" His tone carried the casual disrespect of someone addressing what he perceived as hired help. The serving spoon remained steady in Marina's hand as she met his gaze directly. "What you see is what we have today," she replied, her voice carrying no emotion, no defensiveness, nothing that would feed his need for reaction. This neutrality seemed to frustrate him more than anger would have. Thompson leaned against the serving counter, his bulk intended to intimidate. "Must be nice having such an easy job, while real soldiers do the actual work around here." His companions nodded agreement, their shared assumption being that anyone in support roles lacked the courage or capability for combat positions. Marina ladled his portion with the same mechanical precision she had shown all evening. "Easy is relative," she said simply, a response that somehow managed to sound both agreeable and vaguely threatening without crossing any lines that would justify complaint. The 5 recruits, Dawson, Thompson, Barnes, Martinez, and the quieter but equally dismissive Sullivan, had begun to form the unofficial leadership of their class through a combination of physical size, loud confidence, and willingness to target anyone they perceived as weaker. Their attention was now focused entirely on the small woman behind the serving line who refused to be properly intimidated by their presence. Marina had faced Taliban fighters in close-quarters combat, had eliminated high-value targets in contested urban environments, and had survived situations where hesitation measured in milliseconds meant the difference between mission success and body bags. But standing in a Navy mess hall while being condescended to by teenagers who had never heard a shot fired in anger presented its own unique form of psychological warfare. The evening shift was ending, and the last few stragglers were finishing their meals when Thompson made his decision. He approached the serving line again, this time with his 4 companions flanking him in a loose formation that suggested coordination. Marina noticed the tactical positioning immediately, the way they had unconsciously arranged themselves to control her escape routes, though they probably thought they were just standing casually. "You know what I think?" Thompson said, his voice carrying across the nearly empty mess hall. "I think someone needs to teach you some respect for the people who are actually here to serve our country." His words drew nods from his companions and the attention of the remaining diners, who sensed approaching entertainment. Marina set down the serving spoon and looked directly at Thompson, her expression calm, but suddenly more focused. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read such signs. Unfortunately, none of the recruits facing her had developed that particular skill set yet. The mess hall had grown quiet except for the distant clatter of dishes being cleaned in the back kitchen. 23 pairs of eyes watched as 5 confident recruits prepared to demonstrate their dominance over someone they assumed would provide no meaningful resistance. None of them noticed that Marina's stance had shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight now balanced in a way that would allow explosive movement in any direction. "What kind of respect did you have in mind?" Marina asked, her tone remaining conversational, while her hands remained visible and apparently relaxed. Thompson interpreted this as submission rather than the tactical positioning it actually represented. "The kind that reminds support staff who the real warriors are around here," Thompson replied, stepping closer to the serving counter. His companions spread out slightly, their body language suggesting they expected this encounter to be brief and one-sided. Marina nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering his words. "That seems like an important lesson," she agreed, her voice carrying no hint of the violence she was mentally cataloging and preparing to deploy if these young men pushed their luck any further than they already had. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Thompson's confidence grew with each passing second of Marina's apparent compliance. Behind him, Dawson cracked his knuckles in a gesture meant to be heard, while Barnes positioned himself near the kitchen entrance, effectively cutting off her most obvious retreat route. They had done this before, Marina realized, probably to other support staff who lacked the training to recognize predatory pack behavior. "Maybe we start with teaching you to show proper respect when real servicemen are talking," Thompson continued, his voice gaining volume as he sensed what he mistook for weakness. "You keep that smart mouth shut and remember who you are working for around here." Martinez nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying the performance his leader was putting on for their entertainment. Marina wiped her hands on the kitchen towel draped over her shoulder, a movement so casual that none of the recruits recognized it as preparation for combat. Her pulse remained steady at 62 beats per minute, the same rate she had maintained during nighttime infiltration missions in hostile territory. These boys had no idea they were attempting to intimidate someone who had killed enemy combatants with her bare hands. Sullivan, the quietest of the 5, spoke up from his position near the wall. "She thinks she is hot stuff because she gets to work in the kitchen instead of doing real training like the rest of us." His words carried the particular venom of someone who needed to prove his worth to the more dominant personalities in his group. Marina noted his position and calculated that he would be her 4th target if this escalated beyond verbal intimidation. The mess hall had nearly emptied, leaving only a handful of scattered personnel finishing their meals or lingering over coffee. None of them seemed inclined to intervene in what appeared to be a routine case of senior recruits establishing hierarchy with support staff. Marina had observed similar dynamics in every military installation she had ever served in, though usually she had been the one with obvious rank and authority. Thompson leaned against the serving counter, his bulk intended to loom over her smaller frame. "You know what your problem is, kitchen girl," he said, his tone becoming more personal and aggressive. "You think because you work here that makes you part of the team, but you are just the help, and the help needs to learn their place in the food chain." Marina looked up at him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "What place would that be exactly?" she asked, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone she had used all evening. Thompson interpreted this as either stupidity or defiance, both of which fed his growing aggression. The place where you say yes, sir, and no, sir, and keep your mouth shut unless someone asks you a direct question. Dawson interjected from behind Thompson, stepping closer to add his physical presence to the intimidation. His movement was clumsy and telegraphed, the kind of positioning that would have gotten him killed in actual combat operations. Barnes laughed from his position by the kitchen entrance. "Look at her face," he said to his companions. "She actually thinks she has a choice in this matter." The comment drew chuckles from the group, their confidence building as they fed off each other's energy and Marina's apparent passivity. Marina nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely processing their feedback. "So the lesson you want to teach is about hierarchy and respect," she summarized, her tone remaining completely neutral. The recruits exchanged glances, somewhat puzzled by her calm reaction, but interpreting it as evidence of proper submission rather than tactical assessment. Martinez moved to position himself on Thompson's left, completing what they thought was an intimidating formation, but what Marina recognized as a textbook example of poor tactical positioning. They had clustered themselves together, limiting their individual mobility and creating multiple angles of attack for someone with her training. It was the kind of mistake that would have been punished immediately in any real combat scenario. "That is exactly right," Thompson said, his satisfaction evident as he believed his dominance was being acknowledged. "And the first lesson is that when superior personnel are talking, support staff listens without running their mouth." His companions nodded agreement, their body language suggesting they expected immediate compliance with their newly established rules. Marina glanced around the mess hall, noting the positions of the remaining personnel and calculating sight lines and potential witnesses. The serving area was partially concealed from most of the remaining diners by a structural pillar, which would limit the number of people who could clearly observe what happened next. This was both advantageous and concerning, depending on how far these recruits intended to push their luck. "The thing about hierarchy," Marina said quietly, her hands still casually positioned near the kitchen towel, "is that it only works when everyone agrees on where they fit in the structure." Her words were spoken so softly that the recruits had to lean closer to hear them clearly, unconsciously moving into her preferred engagement range. Thompson's expression shifted from satisfaction to irritation as he sensed something in her tone that did not match his expectations. "What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly as his confidence wavered for the first time in the encounter. Marina had seen that same expression on the faces of enemy fighters who suddenly realized they had made a tactical error. "It means," Marina replied, her voice still conversational, but carrying a new undertone that made Sullivan take an unconscious step backward, that sometimes people make assumptions about hierarchy that turn out to be incorrect. The words hung in the air like a challenge, though delivered with such calm that their full implication was not immediately clear. Barnes pushed off from a wall where he had been leaning, his movement aggressive and intended to reinforce Thompson's authority. "You think you are clever with your word games," he said, advancing toward Marina's position behind the serving counter. "But clever does not change the fact that you are outnumbered 5-1 and completely out of your league here." Marina looked at each of them in turn, her pale green eyes cataloging their positions, their body language, their obvious tells that indicated which one would move first when this transition from verbal to physical intimidation. She had made similar assessments before breaching compounds in Afghanistan, calculating threats and response options in the seconds before explosive action. 5-1, she repeated thoughtfully, as if the odds had not occurred to her before. That has seemed like it should be decisive. Her acknowledgement of their numerical advantage seemed to restore their confidence, though something in her tone suggested the calculation might not be as simple as they assumed. Thompson's satisfaction was evident as he sensed what he interpreted as complete capitulation from the woman behind the serving counter. "Time for the practical demonstration," he announced to his companions, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never faced real resistance. Barnes grinned and moved closer to the serving line, while Martinez cracked his neck in anticipation of what they clearly expected to be easy entertainment. Marina continued wiping down the already clean serving counter, her movements methodical and unhurried. In her peripheral vision, She tracked Sullivan's nervous shifting near the wall and Dawson's obvious excitement as he bounced slightly on the balls of his feet. These young men had no idea they were about to receive the most expensive lesson in tactical awareness the Navy had ever provided. "The lesson starts with you coming around from behind that counter," Thompson commanded, pointing to the opening at the end of the serving line. "We're going to have a little conversation about proper respect, and you're going to learn to listen when your betters are talking to you." His tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never been held accountable for bullying behavior. Marina folded the kitchen towel carefully and set it aside, her movements precise and economical. The action seemed like compliance to the watching recruits, but it actually freed her hands and eliminated any potential entanglement during rapid movement. She had performed similar preparations hundreds of times before engaging hostile targets in close-quarters combat. "Come on, kitchen girl," Barnes called out impatiently, his position near the entrance shifting as he grew eager for action. "We do not have all night for you to work up the courage to follow simple instructions." His comment drew laughter from the group, their confidence building as they misinterpreted her deliberate movements as hesitation born from fear. The few remaining diners in the mess hall continued their conversations, unaware that they were about to witness a demonstration of violence so swift and precise that some of them would later question whether they had actually seen what they thought they saw. Marina noted their positions automatically, calculating potential collateral concerns and witness management in the seconds after contact. Marina stepped around the serving counter with fluid grace, her movement appearing compliant while actually positioning her in optimal tactical alignment with her targets. The recruits unconsciously adjusted their formation to maintain what they thought was intimidating positioning, but they were actually arranging themselves exactly as she would have preferred for sequential engagement. "Much better," Thompson said with obvious satisfaction as Marina approached their group. "Now we can have a proper discussion about hierarchy and respect without any barriers between us." His companions moved closer, forming what they thought was an intimidating circle, but what Marina recognized as a target-rich environment with multiple overlapping fields of fire. Sullivan had positioned himself slightly behind the others, his discomfort with the situation evident in his body language, but his need for group acceptance overriding his instincts. Marina cataloged him as a secondary threat, someone who would likely freeze during initial contact, but might become dangerous if the engagement lasted longer than anticipated. In her experience, the nervous ones sometimes proved the most unpredictable. The lighting in this section of the mess hall cast harsh shadows that would actually work to her advantage, creating visual confusion for anyone trying to track rapid movement. Marina had learned to use environmental factors to her advantage during urban combat operations, where proper positioning often mattered more than superior firepower. Martinez stepped forward, his chest puffed out in a display meant to intimidate through sheer physical presence. "The first thing you need to understand," he announced loudly enough for anyone remaining in the mess hall to hear, "is that support personnel do not get to act like they are equal to actual military personnel." His words carried the arrogance of someone who had never been tested under actual pressure. Marina looked at him with apparent interest, her head tilted slightly as if genuinely considering his perspective. "That is an important distinction," she agreed, her voice maintaining the same calm tone she had used throughout the encounter. "How exactly do you define actual military personnel versus support personnel in this context?" Thompson laughed at what he interpreted as a stupid question. "Actual military personnel are the ones who do the fighting, while support personnel do the cooking and cleaning and other jobs that do not require real courage or skill." His explanation drew nods from his companions, who clearly shared his worldview about military hierarchy and the relative value of different roles. Barnes moved closer, his proximity intended to emphasize their physical advantage. "Support personnel exist to make our jobs easier," he added, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious to someone too dim to understand it naturally. "And that means knowing your place and showing proper respect to the people who actually matter in the military structure." Marina nodded thoughtfully, appearing to absorb their explanation while actually calculating strike angles and sequence timing. So in your understanding, she said slowly, the distinction is based on who does the actual fighting and who provides support functions. Her clarification seemed to please them, as they interpreted it as evidence that their lesson was being properly absorbed. Exactly right, Dawson confirmed, stepping into her personal space with obvious intent to intimidate through proximity. And since we're the ones training to be real fighters while you are just kitchen help, that makes the hierarchy pretty clear. His breath smelled of the evening meal and underlying aggression as he loomed over her smaller frame. The moment had arrived when their verbal dominance display would transition to physical intimidation, and Marina could see the decision forming in Thompson's expression. These young men had crossed every line except the final one, and their body language indicated they were preparing to complete their demonstration of superiority through actual physical contact. Marina shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, her stance appearing casual while actually optimizing for explosive movement in multiple directions. Her hands remained visible and seemingly relaxed, giving no indication that she was prepared to deliver violence so swift and decisive that it would end this encounter before any of them could react to defend themselves. That hierarchy does seem very clear when you explain it that way, Marina said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine understanding. Thompson's smile widened as he prepared to drive home his lesson with the kind of physical contact that would make their point unmistakably clear to this presumptuous support worker. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 5 confident recruits prepared to discover that their assumptions about military hierarchy were about to be corrected in the most direct and painful way possible. Thompson reached out with deliberate slowness, his hand aimed for Marina's shoulder in what he intended to be the first physical assertion of dominance. The movement was telegraphed and clumsy, the kind of approach that would have been instantly punished in any real combat situation. Marina watched his hand approach with the same detached interest she might have shown observing a training exercise designed to demonstrate poor tactical technique. Now that we have established the proper dynamic here, Thompson said as his fingers made contact with Marina's shoulder, we can move on to more specific lessons about respect and following orders. His grip tightened slightly, intended to emphasize his physical control over the situation. Behind him, his 4 companions moved closer, their formation tightening into what they thought was an intimidating display of unified authority. Marina allowed the contact for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for Thompson to commit his weight forward and establish what he believed was dominance. Her expression remained calm and seemingly compliant, giving no indication that she was calculating the precise angle and force required to dislocate his shoulder while simultaneously positioning herself for immediate engagement with his 4 companions. The thing about respect, Marina said quietly, her voice still conversational despite Thompson's grip on her shoulder, is that it usually has to be earned rather than simply demanded. Her words seemed to confuse the recruits, who had expected either submission or ineffective resistance, not philosophical commentary delivered with unnerving calm. Dawson stepped closer from behind Thompson, his bulk intended to reinforce their collective intimidation. You are about to learn what happens when support staff gets too smart for their own good, he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed the outcome was predetermined. His positioning placed him directly in Marina's preferred engagement sequence, though he had no way of knowing that. Barnes moved to flank Marina's left side, his approach casual but clearly coordinated with the others. Maybe after tonight you will remember to keep your mouth shut when real servicemen are giving you instructions, he said, his tone suggesting this was a lesson they had delivered before to other presumptuous support personnel who had forgotten their place in the hierarchy. Martinez positioned himself on Marina's right, completing what they thought was an inescapable formation. 5 against 1 seemed like overwhelming odds to them, particularly when the one was a small woman in kitchen attire who had shown no signs of physical capability or resistance training. Their confidence was absolute, which made what was about to happen even more shocking to witness. Sullivan remained slightly behind the others, his discomfort with the situation evident, but his need for group acceptance overriding his instincts. He would be her last target, Marina decided, since his hesitation might actually work in her favor if she could eliminate the more aggressive threats quickly enough. His position near the wall also gave him fewer escape options, making him easier to control after dealing with the immediate threats. The mess hall had grown quiet except for the distant sounds of kitchen cleanup and the low murmur of conversation from the few remaining diners. None of them were paying particular attention to what appeared to be a routine case of senior personnel establishing authority with a support worker. The lighting cast harsh shadows that would make it difficult for witnesses to clearly observe the details of what was about to unfold. Thompson's grip on Marina's shoulder tightened as he prepared to demonstrate his physical dominance more forcefully. "Time for the practical portion of tonight's lesson," he said, his voice carrying the cruel satisfaction of someone who enjoyed exerting power over those he perceived as helpless. His four companions leaned closer, anticipating the entertainment they expected to follow. Marina's pulse remained steady at 62 beats per minute as she made her final tactical assessment. Thompson's forward weight distribution, Dawson's overconfident positioning, Barnes's exposed left side, Martinez's telegraphed aggression, and Sullivan's nervous retreat toward the wall. She had faced more dangerous opponents in Afghanistan, but rarely one so completely unprepared for actual combat. The moment stretched as Thompson's other hand began to move toward Marina's other shoulder, his intention clearly to establish full physical control before beginning whatever lesson he had planned. His companions watched with obvious anticipation, their attention focused entirely on their expected victim rather than maintaining any defensive awareness of their own positions. Marina looked up at Thompson with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Before we begin this practical lesson," she said softly, her voice requiring him to lean closer to hear clearly, "I should probably mention something about my background that might be relevant to your educational objectives here tonight." Thompson paused, his grip still firm on her shoulder, but his expression shifting slightly as something in her tone registered as different from the submissive compliance he had expected. "What kind of background?" he asked, though his question carried more irritation than genuine interest. His companions remained focused on their anticipated entertainment, unaware that the dynamic was about to shift in ways they could never have imagined. "The kind of background," Marina replied, her voice still quiet but carrying a new undertone that made Sullivan take an unconscious step backward, "that suggests your assumptions about hierarchy and combat capability might need some adjustment." Her words were delivered with such calm that their implications were not immediately clear to the focused aggression of her would-be intimidators. Barnes laughed from his position on her left. "What are you going to do? Cook us to death?" he said, his comment drawing chuckles from a group. His mockery would be the last words he spoke before learning exactly what a Navy SEAL could accomplish in close-quarters combat against untrained opponents who had made every possible tactical error. Marina's expression remained calm as she looked at each of them in turn, her pale green eyes cataloging final positions and calculating the precise sequence of movements that would end this encounter in less than 30 seconds. The recruits interpreted her silence as fear, when it was actually the focused calm of a predator preparing to demonstrate why underestimating your opponent was often a fatal mistake. Thompson's second hand reached for her other shoulder, completing what he believed was total physical control over the situation. None of them noticed that Marina's stance had shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight now distributed in a way that would allow explosive movement in any direction they could not possibly anticipate or counter. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. Marina's left hand moved with surgical precision, her fingers finding the specific pressure point on Thompson's wrist that would cause immediate paralysis of his grip. Simultaneously, her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with exactly the force needed to collapse his diaphragm without causing permanent damage. The combination of movements was so swift and economical that Thompson found himself gasping and stumbling backward before his brain could process what had happened. Dawson reacted first, his larger frame moving toward Marina with the kind of telegraphed aggression that would have gotten him killed in actual combat. His approach was direct and clumsy, relying on size rather than technique. Marina sidestepped his charge with minimal movement, her right foot sweeping behind his ankle while her hand guided his momentum into the serving counter. The impact produced a metallic crash that echoed through the mess hall as Dawson found himself face down against the steel surface. His arm twisted behind his back in a position that made resistance both painful and impossible. Barnes approached from the left with slightly more caution, having witnessed Thompson's unexpected difficulty, but his training was limited to basic hand-to-hand instruction that assumed opponents would fight conventionally. Marina pivoted to face him directly, her stance appearing defensive until the moment he committed to his attack. Her response was a textbook example of close-quarters combat technique, redirecting his momentum while delivering a precise strike to his carotid artery that caused immediate disorientation followed by unconsciousness. Martinez had been moving to flank her right side, but found himself suddenly facing Marina directly as she completed her pivot from Barnes. His hesitation lasted exactly long enough for her to close the distance between them, her approach so swift that his defensive reflex was too slow to be effective. Her knee found his liver with anatomical precision, causing the kind of pain that dropped him to the floor in a gasping heap, while his nervous system tried to process trauma it had never experienced before. Sullivan, who had been hanging back near the wall, suddenly found himself the only recruit still standing and capable of movement. His expression reflected the shock of someone who had just watched four larger, more aggressive companions neutralized in rapid succession by someone they had dismissed as harmless support staff. His fight-or-flight response was clearly triggering, but his positioning near the wall limited his options, while Marina's attention focused entirely on him. The entire sequence had lasted 18 seconds from first contact to Sullivan's moment of paralyzing realization. Thompson was still trying to draw breath while clutching his wrist. Dawson remained pinned against the serving counter with his arm twisted at an angle that made movement inadvisable. Barnes lay unconscious on the floor, and Martinez continued gasping while clutching his side in obvious agony. Marina stood in the center of the chaos she had created, her breathing still calm and controlled, her kitchen uniform unmarked except for a slight wrinkle where Thompson had grabbed her shoulder. Her pale green eyes fixed on Sullivan with the kind of focused attention that made it clear his next decision would determine whether this encounter was over or about to become significantly more unpleasant for him personally. The few remaining diners in the mess hall had finally noticed the commotion, their conversations stopping as they tried to process what they were witnessing. From their distant vantage points, it appeared that 5 recruits had somehow managed to injure themselves simultaneously while confronting a single member of the kitchen staff, an observation that defied logical explanation but matched the evidence before their eyes. Sullivan raised his hands in what could have been either surrender or preparation for defensive action, his expression indicating he was still trying to understand how the situation had reversed so completely and so quickly. His 4 companions had approached this encounter with absolute confidence in their numerical and physical advantages, yet they now represented a textbook example of why assumptions about combat capability could prove dangerously inaccurate. Marina took a single step towards Sullivan, the movement economical, but somehow conveying the impression that she could cover the remaining distance between them faster than he could react to defend himself. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes that suggested this had been a very restrained demonstration compared to what she was actually capable of delivering if the situation required escalation. "You mentioned something about hierarchy," Marina said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the mess hall. Her tone remained conversational despite the dramatic change in circumstances, as if discussing tactical theory rather than addressing someone who had just witnessed 4 of his companions neutralized in less than 20 seconds by someone they had collectively underestimated. Sullivan's mouth opened as if to respond, But no words emerged as his brain struggled to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about combat capability and military hierarchy. The confident assumptions that had seemed so solid minutes earlier had been shattered as completely as his companion's ability to continue their intended lesson about respect and proper behavior. Thompson had managed to regain enough breath to speak, though his voice was strained and his posture remained hunched from the solar plexus impact. "Who the hell are you?" he gasped, his question carrying a mixture of pain, confusion, and dawning awareness that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment about their chosen target. Marina looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. "Someone whose background you might have wanted to verify before beginning your educational demonstration," she replied, her tone suggesting that this outcome had been entirely predictable to anyone who had bothered to gather basic intelligence before engaging a potential opponent. The mess hall had grown completely silent, except for Martinez's continued gasping and the distant sounds of kitchen operations that had continued uninterrupted despite the brief but decisive violence that had just concluded. The few witnesses remained frozen in their seats, uncertain whether they should intervene, call for help, or simply pretend they had not observed what appeared to be an impossible reversal of expected outcomes. Dawson attempted to move from his position against the serving counter, but Marina's glance in his direction convinced him that remaining motionless was the wisest course of action until someone with actual authority arrived to assess the situation. His arm remained twisted behind his back in a position that emphasized how completely his physical advantages had been neutralized by superior technique and training. Sullivan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What kind of background?" he asked, his question echoing Thompson's, but carrying a tone that suggested he was genuinely afraid of the answer rather than simply curious about details that might explain the inexplicable demonstration he had just witnessed. "The kind of background that includes 8 years with naval special warfare," Marina replied, her voice still carrying the same conversational tone despite standing in the center of 4 neutralized opponents. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, specialized training in close-quarters combat, and more confirmed kills than the 5 of you have combined push-ups. Her words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread across Sullivan's expression. Thompson's eyes widened as the implications of her statement penetrated through his pain and confusion. "You're a SEAL," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The question came out more as a statement of dawning horror than genuine inquiry, as if speaking the words aloud might somehow make them less true or less devastating to everything they had assumed about this encounter. "Former SEAL," Marina corrected with clinical precision, "currently assigned to psychological assessment duties for this training facility under light cover to observe recruitment protocols and stress response patterns." Her explanation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading from an official report, though the implications were anything but routine for the recruits who had just provided her with extensive behavioral data. Dawson remained motionless against the serving counter, his position still controlled by Marina's precise application of leverage, but his voice carried clearly as he spoke. "We had no way of knowing," he said, his words sounding more like a plea than an explanation. "The kitchen uniform, the serving duties, everything suggested you were just support personnel, not special operations." Marina nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering his perspective. "That was exactly the point of the cover assignment," she said, "to observe how recruits interact with personnel they perceive as lower in the military hierarchy. Your behavior tonight provided excellent data about underlying attitudes toward support staff and willingness to abuse perceived authority over non-combat personnel." Barnes had regained consciousness but remained on the floor, his position indicating he had decided that movement was inadvisable until the situation stabilized. His voice was slightly slurred from the carotid strike, but his words were clear enough. "Are we going to be reported for this?" he asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the potential consequences of their actions. The question hung in the air as Marina considered her response, her expression suggesting she was weighing multiple factors that went beyond simple disciplinary action. Sullivan remained frozen near the wall, his hands still raised in a gesture that was clearly defensive rather than aggressive. His earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of this devastating revelation about their chosen target. Martinez had managed to sit up, though he remained on the floor, clutching his side where Marina's knee had found his liver. His breathing was still labored, but he could speak well enough to voice the question that was clearly troubling all of them. "What happens to our military careers after this?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected the answer would not be favorable to their future prospects. Marina looked at each of them in turn, her assessment now clinical rather than tactical. The encounter had provided her with extensive data about their character, judgment, and response to authority, none of which reflected well on their suitability for advanced military training. Their willingness to gang up on perceived support staff revealed attitudes that would be problematic in operational environments where teamwork and respect for all personnel were essential. The mess hall remained silent, except for the continued sounds of kitchen operations and the labored breathing of the 4 recruits who were still processing the physical and psychological trauma of their encounter. The few remaining diners had begun to whisper among themselves, clearly trying to understand what they had witnessed without drawing attention to their observation of the aftermath. Sullivan finally lowered his hands, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid any action that might be interpreted as threatening. "We thought you were just kitchen staff," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of shame and confusion. "Everything about your appearance and assignment suggested you were non-combat personnel. How are we supposed to know you were special operations?" Marina considered his question with the same analytical approach she brought to mission debriefings. "You are not supposed to know," she replied. "But that does not excuse the behavior you displayed towards someone you believed was defenseless support staff. Your actions tonight revealed attitudes that would be problematic regardless of my actual background or capabilities." Thompson had managed to straighten up slightly, though his breathing remained difficult and his wrist continued to cause him obvious pain. "Are you going to end our military careers over this?" he asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand that their assumptions about hierarchy and authority had led them into a situation with potentially devastating consequences. The question reflected a fundamental misunderstanding that Marina found almost as troubling as their original behavior. "This is not about ending your careers," she said, her tone carrying a note of disappointment that was somehow more cutting than anger would have been. "This is about whether you have the character and judgment necessary for military service in the first place." Dawson attempted to shift his position against the serving counter, but Marina's glance reminded him that his current situation was entirely dependent on her continued restraint. "We understand that now," he said, his words coming out in a rush, as if speed might somehow diminish their impact. "We made a mistake in judgment, and we are willing to accept whatever consequences are appropriate for our actions." Marina studied his expression, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than simple fear of punishment. The distinction was crucial because it would determine whether these recruits might eventually develop into functional military personnel or whether they represented fundamental character flaws that could not be corrected through additional training or discipline. Barnes spoke from his position on the floor, his voice still showing the effects of the carotid strike, but his words carefully chosen. "We never should have treated anyone the way we treated you tonight, regardless of their position or background." His statement seemed to reflect genuine remorse rather than simple regret at being caught, which Marina noted as potentially significant for any future assessment of his character. The admission was progress, but Marina remained skeptical about whether the lesson they were learning was about respect for all personnel or simply about being more careful in selecting targets for their aggression. The distinction would be crucial for determining their suitability for continued military service and her recommendations to Commander Hayes about their future in the program. Marina allowed Dawson to carefully extract himself from the serving counter, his movements slow and deliberate as he tested whether his arm still functioned properly after her precise application of leverage. His relief at discovering no permanent damage was evident, though the lesson about what could have happened if she had chosen to escalate her response was clearly not lost on him or his companions. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor leading to the mess hall, the measured pace suggesting military personnel rather than casual, late-evening traffic. Marina recognized the distinctive rhythm of Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez before he appeared in the doorway, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the scene with the kind of tactical awareness that came from decades of service in challenging environments. Rodriguez took in the tableau with practiced efficiency, noting the positions of the 5 recruits, Marina's unmarked appearance despite clear evidence of recent conflict, and the obvious tension that still filled the air. His expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested he was not entirely surprised to find this particular situation developing in his facility. Petty Officer Volkov, Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone addressing a subordinate while acknowledging her actual rank and capabilities. I trust your evening duties have been educational for all parties involved. His words were carefully chosen to avoid prejudicing any official assessment, while clearly indicating he understood more about the situation than the scattered evidence might suggest to a casual observer. Very educational, Master Chief, Marina replied, her own tone matching his formality while conveying respect for his position and experience. The recruits have demonstrated several interesting behavioral patterns that will be valuable for my assessment report to Commander Hayes. Her response confirmed that this encounter would indeed become part of official documentation rather than remaining an informal lesson. Sullivan had remained motionless near the wall throughout the exchange, but Rodriguez's arrival seemed to give him permission to speak. Master Chief, he said, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone who recognized they were in serious trouble, we made some serious errors in judgment tonight, and we understand there will be consequences for our actions. Rodriguez turned his attention to Sullivan with the kind of focused scrutiny that made experienced personnel nervous and left recruits feeling completely exposed. Define errors in judgment, he said, his tone suggesting that the accuracy and completeness of Sullivan's response would factor significantly into any subsequent evaluation of his character and suitability for continued training. Thompson had managed to regain enough composure to participate in the conversation, though his voice still carried the strain of his earlier encounter with Marina's elbow. We assumed Petty Officer Volkov was support staff, and we treated her with disrespect that was inappropriate regardless of her actual position or background. His admission was more comprehensive than Sullivan's, suggesting he understood the broader implications of their behavior. Barnes remained on the floor, but had propped himself up enough to address Rodriguez directly. We ganged up on someone we thought was defenseless and tried to intimidate her into accepting our authority over her. His statement was blunt and honest, carrying the tone of someone who had decided that minimizing their actions would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression indicating he was cataloging their responses for future reference. Martinez, he said, turning his attention to the recruit who was still clutching his side, what is your assessment of tonight's events and your role in them? His question was delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested this was as much a psychological evaluation as a disciplinary inquiry. Martinez struggled to his feet with obvious effort, his movement careful and painful, but clearly intended to show respect for Rodriguez's authority. Master Chief, we violated basic military principles about respect for all personnel, and we attempted to abuse authority we had not earned and did not actually possess. His response demonstrated understanding that went beyond simple acknowledgement of rule violations. The accuracy of their self-assessments was encouraging from a character development perspective, but Marina remained skeptical about whether this understanding reflected genuine growth or simply fear-driven compliance with obvious expectations. The distinction would be crucial for determining their long-term suitability for military service and the kind of additional training or counseling they might require. Rodriguez had clearly reached his own preliminary conclusions about the situation, but his next words were directed toward Marina rather than the recruits. Petty Officer Volkov, he said, his tone indicating this was an official request rather than casual conversation. I would appreciate your preliminary assessment of tonight's events for inclusion in my report to Commander Hayes. Marina considered her response carefully, aware that her words would carry significant weight in determining the future military careers of 5 young men who had made serious errors but might still possess the potential for development into functional service members. The balance between accountability and redemption was delicate, particularly given the nature of their offenses and the attitudes they had revealed. Based on tonight's observations, Marina said, her voice taking on the formal tone of an official assessment, these recruits demonstrated problematic attitudes toward personnel they perceived as lower in military hierarchy, willingness to abuse assumed authority, and poor judgment in tactical situations. However, their post-incident responses suggest potential for character development if properly addressed through additional training and counseling. Rodriguez nodded, his expression indicating he had expected a similar assessment. The recruits remained silent, clearly understanding that their immediate future was being determined by this exchange between 2 experienced personnel whose judgment would carry decisive weight with facility command. Their earlier confidence had been completely replaced by awareness of how precarious their situation had become. Dawson finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood they were fighting for their military futures. Master Chief, is there any possibility for us to demonstrate that we have learned from this experience and can develop into the kind of personnel the Navy needs? His question was carefully phrased to avoid sounding like a plea while acknowledging the gravity of their situation. Rodriguez considered the question with the same deliberate approach he brought to all personnel decisions. That determination will be made by Commander Hayes based on multiple factors, including tonight's incident, your response to remedial training, and your demonstrated commitment to the core values that define military service. His answer provided hope without making promises about outcomes that remained uncertain. Commander Hayes entered the mess hall with a quiet authority that marked senior officers who had earned their position through years of operational experience rather than administrative advancement. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, as both Rodriguez and Marina shifted to formal attention while the 5 recruits struggled to present themselves as properly as their various injuries and states of disarray would allow. Hayes surveyed the scene with a kind of comprehensive assessment that missed nothing, his experienced eyes noting the positioning of personnel, the evidence of recent conflict, and the obvious tension that filled the space. His expression remained neutral, but something in his bearing suggested he had been briefed on the general situation before deciding to observe the aftermath personally rather than relying solely on written reports. Master Chief Rodriguez, Hayes said, his voice carrying the crisp formality of official inquiry, please provide your initial assessment of tonight's incident for the record. His request was delivered with the tone of someone who expected complete accuracy rather than interpretation or opinion. Though both men understood that Rodriguez's evaluation would carry significant weight in any subsequent decisions. Rodriguez maintained his formal posture as he responded. Sir, 5 recruits engaged in inappropriate behavior toward Petty Officer Volkov, whom they mistakenly assumed to be non-combat support staff. Their actions included verbal intimidation, physical positioning intended to threaten, and actual physical contact without consent. Petty Officer Volkov responded with minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat and control the situation. Hayes turned his attention to Marina, his expression indicating he expected her own assessment of the events. Petty Officer Volkov, he said, his tone remaining official but carrying an undertone that suggested personal familiarity with her background and capabilities, your perspective on tonight's incident and its implications for the recruitment evaluation process you're conducting. Marina straightened slightly before responding, her voice taking on the clinical tone of professional analysis. Sir, the recruits demonstrated concerning attitudes toward personnel they perceived as subordinate, including willingness to use numerical advantage and implied threats to establish dominance. Their behavior suggests underlying character issues that could prove problematic in operational environments where respect for all team members is essential for mission success. Thompson had been gathering courage to speak throughout the formal exchange, and Hayes's slight nod in his direction gave him permission to address the commanding officer directly. "Sir," he said, his voice still strained, but carrying obvious sincerity, "we understand that our behavior was completely inappropriate and violated fundamental military values about respect and proper conduct. We accept full responsibility for our actions, and any consequences you determine are appropriate." Hayes studied Thompson's expression with the kind of penetrating assessment that experienced officers use to evaluate character under pressure. "Accepting responsibility is appropriate," he said, his tone neutral but not dismissive. "But the more important question is whether you understand why such behavior is fundamentally incompatible with military service and what changes in attitude and conduct will be necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future." Barnes had managed to stand, though his movement remained careful and his balance slightly uncertain from the effects of Marina's carotid strike. "Sir," he said, his words chosen with obvious care, "we demonstrated that we are not yet ready for the responsibility and authority that comes with military service. We need additional training in character development and respect for all personnel before we can be trusted to represent the values of the Navy." The admission was more comprehensive than Hayes had expected from recruits in their position, suggesting that the shock of their encounter with Marina had produced genuine self-reflection rather than simple fear of punishment. This distinction was crucial for determining whether remedial action might prove effective or whether their character flaws were too fundamental to address through additional training. Martinez had remained relatively quiet during the formal proceedings, but Hayes's attention turned to him with obvious expectation of participation. Martinez straightened as much as his injured condition would allow before speaking. "Sir, tonight showed us that we had developed attitudes and behaviors that have no place in professional military service. We thought we understood hierarchy and respect, but we actually understood neither concept properly." Hayes nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was weighing multiple factors in forming his assessment of the situation. "Sullivan," he said, turning to the recruit who had witnessed the entire encounter without suffering physical consequences, "your observation of tonight's events and their significance for your continued participation in this program." Sullivan's response came after a moment of obvious consideration, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood their words would have lasting consequences. "Sir, watching my companions get neutralized so quickly and completely by someone we had dismissed as harmless taught me that our assumptions about capability and hierarchy were dangerous and wrong. We need to fundamentally change how we evaluate and interact with other people." The comprehensive nature of their responses suggested that the psychological impact of their encounter with Marina had been even more significant than the physical demonstration of her capabilities. Hayes appeared to be reaching similar conclusions as he observed their body language and listened to their attempts to articulate lessons learned from the experience. Commander Hayes turned back to Marina, his expression indicating he valued her professional assessment as much as her personal experience with the recruits. "Petty Officer Volkov, based on your training in psychological evaluation and your direct observation of their behavior both during and after the incident, what is your recommendation regarding their continued participation in this program?" Marina considered her response carefully, aware that her words would likely determine whether 5 young men continued their military careers or found themselves pursuing civilian alternatives. The balance between accountability and opportunity for growth was delicate, particularly given the serious nature of their offenses and the attitudes they had revealed through their actions. "Sir," Marina said, her voice carrying the measured tone of professional judgment, "their post-incident responses suggest potential for character development if subjected to intensive remedial training focused on respect, appropriate use of authority, and fundamental military values. However, such training would need to be comprehensive and their progress carefully monitored to ensure genuine change rather than superficial compliance." Hayes absorbed her recommendation with the kind of thoughtful consideration that marked experienced commanders who understood that personnel decisions had lasting implications for both individuals and institutional culture. The recruits remained silent, clearly understanding that their immediate futures hung in the balance of this exchange between senior personnel whose judgment would prove decisive. Hayes walked slowly around the mess hall, his movement deliberate as he examined the physical evidence of the encounter while processing the testimonies he had heard from all parties involved. His inspection was thorough, but not theatrical, the methodical approach of someone gathering information rather than making dramatic gestures for psychological effect. The recruits remained at attention, their obvious discomfort increasing with each passing moment of silence. The overturned chair near the serving counter told part of the story, as did the slight dent in the steel surface where Dawson had made contact during his brief encounter with superior technique. Hayes noted these details without comment, his expression remaining neutral as he cataloged evidence that supported the accounts he had heard from both sides of the confrontation. "Master Chief Rodriguez," Hayes said finally, his voice breaking the tension that had built during his silent assessment, "I want these recruits placed in administrative hold pending completion of a comprehensive character evaluation. They will be separated from the general recruit population until we determine their suitability for continued military service." His decision was delivered with the finality of command authority, though it left room for eventual redemption rather than immediate dismissal. Rodriguez acknowledged the order with crisp professionalism. "Understood, sir. I will coordinate with the facility psychologist to establish an appropriate evaluation protocol and interim training regimen focused on character development and military values." His response indicated he had anticipated this outcome and was prepared to implement the necessary administrative measures immediately. Hayes turned his attention back to the 5 recruits, his expression carrying the weight of someone delivering life-changing decisions. "Your immediate future in this program depends entirely on your ability to demonstrate genuine character growth rather than superficial compliance with expectations. The evaluation process will be comprehensive and your progress will be monitored continuously by personnel with extensive experience in assessing military potential." Thompson stepped forward slightly, his movement careful to avoid any action that might be interpreted as challenging authority. "Sir, may we ask what specific areas of development will be emphasized during this evaluation period?" His question was respectfully phrased and seemed to reflect genuine interest in improvement rather than simple concern about meeting minimum requirements. Hayes considered the question with obvious deliberation before responding. "You will receive intensive instruction in military ethics, appropriate exercise of authority, respect for all personnel regardless of position or background, and tactical awareness that includes proper threat assessment. Additionally, you will undergo psychological counseling to address the underlying attitudes that led to tonight's incident." Barnes raised his hand in a gesture requesting permission to speak, waiting for Hayes's nod before proceeding. "Sir, will we have the opportunity to interact with other personnel during this evaluation period, or will we be completely isolated from the regular training program?" His question reflected practical concerns about their social and professional development during what appeared to be an extended remedial period. "You will have supervised interaction with other personnel as part of your evaluation," Hayes replied, his tone indicating this aspect of their program had been carefully considered. "Your behavior during these interactions will be closely monitored and will factor significantly into our assessment of your progress and suitability for continued military service. Every interaction will be treated as a test of your developing character and judgment." Martinez had been listening intently to the exchange, and his question reflected concerns that went beyond immediate consequences. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying obvious anxiety, "will this incident and evaluation period become part of our permanent military records, and how will it affect our future career opportunities if we are ultimately retained in the program?" Hayes's response was direct and honest in the way that experienced military leaders approach difficult questions. "This incident will be documented in your records, along with the evaluation process and its outcomes. If you successfully complete remedial training and demonstrate genuine character development, that growth will also be documented. Future opportunities will depend on your ability to prove that tonight's behavior was an aberration rather than an indication of fundamental character flaws. Sullivan had remained quiet throughout most of the formal proceedings, but Hayes's expectant look indicated he was expected to participate in the discussion. "Sir," he said, his voice reflecting the weight of everything he had witnessed and learned, "what specific behaviors or attitudes do we need to change to convince you that we are worthy of continued military service and the trust that comes with it?" The question demonstrated a level of self-awareness that Hayes found encouraging, though he remained cautious about interpreting apparent insight as genuine understanding. "You need to develop genuine respect for all personnel regardless of their position, background, or perceived authority level," he said. "You need to understand that military hierarchy exists to serve mission objectives, not to provide opportunities for personal power trips or entertainment at others' expense." Dawson had been processing the implications of their situation throughout the formal discussion, and his question reflected concerns about practical implementation of their remedial program. "Sir, who will be responsible for evaluating our progress during this period, and what criteria will be used to determine whether we have successfully addressed the character issues that led to tonight's incident?" Hayes indicated Marina with a slight gesture before responding. "Petty Officer Volkov will be conducting ongoing psychological assessment as part of her current assignment to this facility. Her evaluation of your progress will carry significant weight in our final determination about your military futures. Additionally, Master Chief Rodriguez will provide regular reports on your conduct and attitude during supervised activities." The irony of having their victim become their evaluator was not lost on any of the recruits, though their expressions suggested they understood the appropriateness of such an arrangement given Marina's qualifications and direct experience with their problematic behavior. This dynamic would create additional pressure for genuine change rather than superficial performance designed to satisfy minimum requirements. Marina spoke for the first time since providing her initial assessment, her voice carrying the clinical tone of professional evaluation. "The evaluation process will include both formal psychological testing and ongoing behavioral observation in various situations designed to assess your genuine attitudes toward authority, hierarchy, and interpersonal relationships. Your awareness that you are being evaluated will be part of the test, rather than a limitation of its validity." Hayes nodded approvingly at Marina's explanation before delivering his final instructions to the assembled personnel. "Master Chief Rodriguez will coordinate the administrative details of their separation from regular training activities. Petty Officer Volkov will establish the evaluation protocol and timeline. The recruits will report to designated quarters immediately and await further instructions about their interim training schedule and requirements." 3 weeks had passed since the mess hall incident, and the 5 recruits found themselves in a conference room facing Marina across a polished table that reflected the overhead fluorescent lighting. Their posture was markedly different from their previous encounter, each man sitting with the kind of respectful attention that suggested genuine change rather than fearful compliance. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in behavioral assessment. Marina reviewed the evaluation file spread before her, each folder containing detailed documentation of psychological testing, behavioral observations, and progress reports from their intensive remedial training period. The data painted a complex picture of 5 young men struggling to reconcile their previous assumptions about military hierarchy with newly understood concepts of genuine leadership and respect for all personnel. Thompson sat directly across from Marina, his hands folded on the table in a gesture that conveyed both respect and nervous anticipation. During the past 3 weeks, his file showed consistent engagement with counseling sessions, genuine participation in ethics discussions, and behavioral changes that appeared to reflect internal growth rather than external compliance with requirements. The psychological testing results indicate significant progress in all 5 cases, Marina said, her voice carrying the measured tone of professional assessment. However, psychological testing can only measure conscious attitudes and stated intentions. The more important evaluation involves your demonstrated behavior in situations where you believe you are not being actively observed for assessment purposes. Dawson straightened slightly at this statement, his expression reflecting awareness that their evaluation had been more comprehensive than they had realized. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defensive concern, "can you provide specific examples of behaviors or situations that factored into your assessment of our progress in character development?" Marina consulted her notes before responding, her approach methodical and clinical. "Last Tuesday, you encountered a female maintenance worker struggling with a heavy equipment cart near the barracks. Your response was to immediately offer assistance and engage in respectful conversation about her work responsibilities. This behavior was observed by facility personnel, but not identified as an evaluation scenario to you at the time." Thompson nodded, his expression indicating he remembered the incident clearly. "Ma'am, that interaction felt natural and appropriate based on what we have learned about respect for all personnel regardless of their position or background. We did not realize it was being observed for evaluation purposes, which I suppose was exactly the point of monitoring our behavior in unstructured situations." Barnes leaned forward slightly, his movement conveying engaged interest rather than defensive positioning. "Ma'am," he said, his tone reflecting genuine curiosity about the evaluation process, "were there other situations where our behavior was being assessed without our knowledge, and how did our responses compare to your expectations based on our stated commitment to character development?" Marina referenced another section of her documentation before responding. "Friday evening, Martinez encountered a dispute between two junior recruits in a common area. His response was to de-escalate the situation through calm intervention rather than asserting authority or seeking entertainment from their conflict. This represented a significant departure from the behavioral patterns he demonstrated during our initial encounter." Martinez's expression reflected both pride in his progress and continuing awareness of how far he had come from his previous attitudes. "Ma'am, that situation required me to think about what kind of leader I want to become rather than what kind of power I thought I deserved. The counseling sessions helped me understand that real authority comes from earning respect rather than demanding submission from people you perceive as weaker." Sullivan had remained quiet during most of the evaluation discussion, but Marina's attention turned to him with obvious expectation of participation. "Sullivan," she said, "your psychological testing scores showed the most dramatic improvement in areas related to empathy and perspective taking. Can you describe how your understanding of military hierarchy and interpersonal relationships has changed during this evaluation period?" Sullivan took a moment to organize his thoughts before responding, his expression reflecting the kind of serious consideration that suggested genuine introspection. "Ma'am, I realized that I had been confusing dominance with leadership and intimidation with respect. The incident in the mess hall forced me to confront the fact that I was becoming the kind of person I would not want to serve under or alongside in actual military operations." The comprehensiveness of their responses suggested that the remedial training had indeed produced substantial changes in their attitudes and understanding, though Marina remained cautious about distinguishing between genuine transformation and sophisticated performance designed to achieve desired outcomes. The distinction was crucial for determining their suitability for continued military service. Marina closed the evaluation files and looked at each recruit in turn, her expression conveying the gravity of the moment. "Based on all available data, including psychological testing, behavioral observation, and demonstrated progress during remedial training, I am prepared to recommend your continuation in the program with specific conditions and ongoing monitoring requirements." The relief that crossed their faces was immediate and obvious, though each man maintained formal composure appropriate to the official nature of the proceedings. Thompson spoke for the group when he said, "Ma'am, we understand that this recommendation represents trust that we have not yet fully earned, and we are committed to continuing the character development that began during this evaluation period." Marina nodded, acknowledging his statement while preparing to deliver the conditions that would govern their continued participation. Your continuation in the program requires ongoing psychological counseling, regular behavioral assessment, and demonstration of sustained character growth over an extended period. Additionally, you will serve as mentors for incoming recruits, helping them avoid the mistakes that led to your own remedial training. Dawson's expression reflected understanding of the significance of this mentoring responsibility. Ma'am, serving as mentors will require us to model the kind of behavior and attitudes we failed to demonstrate initially. This creates accountability that goes beyond our own development to include responsibility for guiding others toward appropriate military conduct and character. The mentoring component had been carefully designed to reinforce their own character development while providing practical demonstration of their genuine commitment to military values. Marina had observed that people often solidified their own learning by teaching others, and this arrangement would provide ongoing opportunities to assess their continued growth and development. Barnes spoke with obvious sincerity when he addressed the mentoring responsibility. Ma'am, having the opportunity to help other recruits avoid our mistakes feels like a chance to contribute something positive after causing so much concern about our suitability for military service. We want to prove that the investment in our remedial training was worthwhile and that we can become the kind of leaders the Navy needs. 6 months after the mess hall incident, Marina stood in the same facility observing a new group of incoming recruits as they processed through their first week of orientation. Her assignment had been extended specifically to monitor the long-term effectiveness of the remedial program and to assess whether the 5 recruits from that evening had sustained their character development or reverted to previous behavioral patterns once the immediate pressure of evaluation had passed. Thompson approached the serving line where Marina was once again working in her cover role as kitchen staff, though this time her presence was known to facility leadership as an ongoing psychological assessment operation. His demeanor was completely transformed from their first encounter, his interaction marked by genuine respect and professional courtesy that appeared natural rather than performed for observation. "Good evening, Petty Officer Volkov," Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful acknowledgement that reflected both her rank and his appreciation for the role she had played in his development. The new recruits behind him in line listened to his interaction, clearly taking cues from someone they had been told was an experienced member of their training class. Marina nodded acknowledgement while continuing to serve portions, her observation extending beyond Thompson to include his influence on the newer personnel. The ripple effect of his changed behavior was evident in how the other recruits approached the serving line with appropriate respect rather than the casual dismissiveness that had characterized previous groups of incoming personnel. Dawson had been assigned as orientation leader for the newest group of recruits, a responsibility that required him to model appropriate military bearing and interpersonal conduct. His briefings to incoming personnel now included specific instruction about respect for all facility staff regardless of their apparent position or background, lessons drawn directly from his own expensive education in assumptions and hierarchy. The new recruits processed through their evening meal with efficient courtesy, their behavior reflecting the standards that had been established by the reformed group that now served as their immediate mentors and examples. The contrast with previous recruit behavior was dramatic and sustained, suggesting that the investment in character development had produced lasting institutional change rather than temporary compliance. Barnes had volunteered for additional duty as a peer counselor, providing guidance to recruits who struggled with authority issues or interpersonal conflicts during their training period. His own experience with the consequences of poor judgment gave him credibility with personnel who might otherwise dismiss advice from instructors who had never faced similar challenges. Marina observed these developments with professional satisfaction, noting that the 5 recruits had not only sustained their own character growth, but had become positive influences within the broader recruit population. Their transformation from problematic personnel to effective mentors represented the kind of outcome that justified comprehensive remedial programs rather than immediate dismissal for character violations. Martinez approached Marina near the end of the serving period, his interaction casual but respectful in a way that demonstrated internalized change rather than conscious performance. "Ma'am," he said, his tone conversational but appropriately deferential. "Recruit Patterson has been struggling with some attitude issues that remind me of our own challenges when we first arrived. Would it be appropriate for me to share some of our experiences with him as a way of helping him avoid similar mistakes?" The request demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mentoring responsibilities and appropriate boundaries, reflecting growth that extended well beyond simple compliance with rules about respectful behavior. Marina appreciated that Martinez was seeking guidance rather than assuming he had authority to counsel other personnel without proper coordination. "That would be appropriate if coordinated through Master Chief Rodriguez," Marina replied, her response providing both permission and proper procedural framework. "Your experiences could be valuable for helping other recruits understand the importance of character development and appropriate conduct, particularly if presented as lessons learned rather than warnings about consequences." Sullivan had been observing the interaction between Marina and Martinez, and his approach reflected the kind of thoughtful consideration that had become characteristic of his behavior since completing remedial training. "Ma'am," he said, his question clearly prepared through careful consideration, "we have been discussing among ourselves how to share our experiences with incoming recruits in a way that helps them learn from our mistakes without making them feel threatened or defensive about their own attitudes." The sophistication of their approach to mentoring responsibilities exceeded Marina's initial expectations and suggested that their character development had produced genuinely mature understanding of leadership and interpersonal dynamics rather than simple rule-following behavior. Their ability to think systematically about influencing positive change in others indicated substantial personal growth. Marina set down her serving utensil and gave Sullivan her full attention, recognizing that this conversation represented an important moment in assessing their continued development. "The key is helping them understand that everyone enters military service with civilian attitudes that need adjustment," she said. "Your role is to help them recognize and address those attitudes before they lead to serious mistakes, rather than making them feel ashamed of normal adjustment challenges." Thompson rejoined the conversation, his presence natural rather than intrusive in a way that demonstrated improved social awareness. "We have been thinking about developing a presentation for new recruit orientation that covers respect, hierarchy, and appropriate conduct without specifically referencing our own incident. The goal would be prevention rather than remediation, using our understanding to help others avoid similar problems entirely." The proposal reflected exactly the kind of proactive leadership that Marina hoped their remedial training would ultimately produce. Their focus had shifted from personal rehabilitation to institutional improvement, indicating that they had internalized military values rather than simply learning to comply with behavioral expectations for their own benefit. Marina considered their proposal with obvious approval, though her response maintained appropriate professional boundaries. That initiative would need approval from Commander Hayes and coordination with the facility training staff, she said. However, the concept demonstrates exactly the kind of positive contribution that justifies the investment made in your character development and continued military service. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a new group of recruits who had clearly been briefed about proper conduct during meal service. Their respectful interaction with Marina and appropriate behavior in the mess hall reflected the positive influence that the reformed group had established within the facility culture, creating an environment where character problems were addressed before they escalated to serious incidents. As the evening meal service concluded, Marina reflected on the comprehensive transformation she had observed over the past 6 months. The 5 recruits who had once represented significant character risks had become positive influences whose leadership was helping to prevent similar problems among newer personnel. Their development justified the decision to pursue remedial training rather than immediate dismissal, and their ongoing contributions suggested that investment would continue to pay dividends for the facility and the broader military community they would eventually join. 1 year after the mess hall incident, Marina stood before Commander Hayes in his office, delivering her final assessment report on the comprehensive character development program that had grown from that single evening of poor judgment and swift correction. The data she presented painted a picture of institutional transformation that extended far beyond the 5 individuals who had triggered the initial intervention. The behavioral metrics for incoming recruits show a 73% reduction in interpersonal incidents during their first month of training, Marina reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional recommendations had produced measurable positive outcomes. The mentoring program established by Thompson, Dawson, Barnes, Martinez, and Sullivan has created a culture where character issues are addressed proactively rather than reactively. Hayes reviewed the comprehensive documentation Marina had compiled, his expression reflecting both professional approval and personal satisfaction with outcomes that exceeded initial expectations. Their transformation from problem personnel to institutional assets represents exactly the kind of investment in human potential that justifies comprehensive remedial programs over immediate dismissal for character violations. Marina continued her briefing with specific examples of the ripple effects their development had produced throughout the facility. The presentation they developed for new recruit orientation has been adopted as standard curriculum, and their peer counseling program has been requested by 3 other training facilities based on our documented results. Their personal growth has generated systemic improvements that will benefit military personnel for years to come. The 5 recruits themselves had not only completed their basic training successfully, but had earned recommendations for advanced leadership development programs based on their demonstrated character growth and positive influence on facility culture. Their journey from problematic personnel to recognized leaders represented a case study in the effectiveness of targeted intervention and comprehensive character development. Hayes closed the assessment files and looked directly at Marina, his expression conveying both professional respect and personal gratitude for her role in transforming a potentially destructive incident into a catalyst for positive institutional change. Petty Officer Volkov, your psychological assessment capabilities and tactical restraint during the initial incident created the foundation for everything that followed. Your recommendation for remedial training rather than immediate dismissal has produced benefits that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. Marina accepted the recognition with professional modesty while internally acknowledging the satisfaction of seeing her assessment and recommendations validated by long-term outcomes. The incident demonstrated that character violations often reflect inadequate understanding rather than irredeemable flaws, and that appropriate intervention can transform problematic personnel into valuable contributors to military culture and effectiveness. The broader implications of their success had already begun influencing policy discussions at higher levels of military leadership, with requests for information about the program structure and methodology coming from facilities throughout the Navy and other service branches. What had begun as a response to a single incident had evolved into a model for character development that could be replicated across the military. Thompson appeared in the office doorway, his presence requested for the final assessment meeting as a representative of the group whose transformation had generated such positive outcomes. His bearing reflected the confident professionalism of someone who had earned his position through demonstrated character growth rather than inherited authority, and his interaction with both Marina and Commander Hayes showed genuine respect born from shared experience rather than fearful compliance. "Sir," Thompson said, addressing Commander Hayes with appropriate formality, "the 5 of us wanted to express our appreciation for the opportunity to learn from our mistakes rather than having our military careers ended because of them. The investment in our character development has allowed us to contribute positively to military culture rather than being dismissed as examples of personnel who lacked the character necessary for military service." Hayes acknowledged Thompson's statement with the kind of measured approval that experienced commanders reserve for personnel who had proven themselves through sustained performance rather than momentary achievement. Your group's development from problematic recruits to effective mentors demonstrates that character can be developed through appropriate intervention and sustained effort. Your continued success validates the decision to pursue remedial training rather than immediate dismissal. Marina observed the interaction with professional satisfaction, noting the natural respect and genuine communication that had replaced the artificial hierarchy and intimidation tactics that had characterized Thompson's initial approach to military relationships. His transformation was complete and sustainable, reflecting internalized values rather than external compliance with behavioral expectations. The meeting concluded with discussion of plans to document their program methodology for broader implementation, ensuring that other facilities could benefit from the lessons learned during this extended character development initiative. The 5 recruits would continue their military service with permanent assignments that utilized their unique experience in mentoring and character development roles. As Thompson departed to rejoin his companions, Marina reflected on the comprehensive transformation she had witnessed and helped facilitate over the past year. 5 young men who had once cornered someone they perceived as helpless kitchen staff had become leaders whose influence was helping create military culture that valued all personnel and addressed character issues before they escalated to serious problems. If you enjoyed this story and connected with the transformation these recruits experienced, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment or character. Have you witnessed similar situations where someone showed hidden strength or where people learned important lessons about respect and character? Share your thoughts about what resonated most with you from this journey of growth and redemption. The mess hall, where everything began, remained largely unchanged, but the culture within those walls had been transformed by the ripple effects of one evening when assumptions about hierarchy and capability had been corrected in the most direct and educational way possible. Marina's mission had evolved from simple psychological assessment to comprehensive culture change, producing benefits that would influence military personnel development for years to come. Commander Hayes signed the final documentation that would make their character development program available to other facilities, his signature representing official recognition that investment in human potential could produce extraordinary returns when applied with appropriate expertise and sustained commitment. The incident that had begun with 5 recruits cornering someone in a mess hall had become a model for transforming military culture through character development and genuine leadership training. The legacy of that 30-second encounter would extend far beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing how the military approached character development and personnel retention for decades to come. Marina's tactical restraint and professional assessment had created opportunities for growth that transformed not only 5 problematic recruits, but the entire institutional culture they would influence throughout their military careers.